Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Info Study 753, Preserving Infomedia Lecture, Preservation Planning. So this week we'll be talking about what kind of information should be contained in preservation policies, and we'll also be talking about preservation programs as well. We'll be discussing the similarities between analog preservation policies and digital preservation policies, and again, kind of touching on the more detailed programs also, and looking at some differences, and talking generally about the benefits of incorporating a preservation policy / program. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the differences between a policy and a program. So as with our discussion of digital preservation, the differences can be fairly substantial between these two documents. So a policy is more of an overarching declaration of the aims and goals of an institution's preservation efforts, and a preservation program is a more detailed illustration of how those aims and goals will be carried out and implemented and evaluated and so on. So the Rissenthaler chapter that we wrote for this week mentions the development of a preservation policy as being the first step of developing a preservation program. So again, harkening back to the reality that a policy is more broad in general, and then a program is much more specific and includes things that aren't necessarily discussed during a policy. Of course, you're going to have policies of varying length and complexity, as the British Library preservation policy reading for this week noted, but typically a program is going to be much lengthier and much more detailed and specific. So for example, the Rissenthaler chapter also mentioned that a preservation program might include a preservation needs assessment, which is something that we'll talk a little bit more about this week and a whole lot more in a future lecture. Planning and establishing priorities, staff and researcher training, environmental monitoring and control, holdings maintenance and storage systems, emergency preparedness and recovery plans, duplication and reformatting, and conservation treatment. So all these different aspects of analog preservation will be described in more detail, again, in a more specific preservation program. So what I'll do real quick is I'll come out of our slideshow here, and I managed to find a preservation policy for the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa. And just looking at it, you can see that it's a pretty broad document, and apparently one that hasn't been updated fairly recently. I'll also mention that it was much easier to find digital preservation policies as opposed to analog preservation policies, which I thought was interesting. I don't know if archives assume that people are less familiar with digital preservation, and so that there's more of a need to communicate what digital preservation is and why it's important, which maybe is true, but it was difficult to find preservation policies, at least ones available online, that weren't related to digital preservation as opposed to the analog digital preservation part of this course, which we're discussing today. So we have some mandates that the archive has, talking about preservation as a top priority, in line with acceptable international standards, but they don't really talk about which ones. efforts are being made to ensure records are properly looked after. Which efforts? Again, not a whole lot of detail here. And they talk about how this policy must be read with the detailed National Archives and Records Service policy guidelines and other strategies of the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa. So talking about how this is just one document kind of within the greater context of what the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa is involved with, which is something that a few of our readings mentioned, how a good thing about having a policy, and we'll touch on this later, is that it places preservation within context and within kind of equal ranking to other activities that archives engage in. So this is saying, look, this is just one piece of the puzzle, and there are other things that we're involved with, but this is important too. Okay, so looking more specifically at the policy part, ensure the facilities in which the records are kept internationally, kept to meet internationally accepted standards. Again, not which standards, but really how they're going to do this. Ensure that conditions, internationally accepted standards. Again, not really specifics on how they're going to do it. Reduce risk. Okay, how? Talking about providing copies for use when originals are not in usable condition. So not really a lot of information on what decides what shape an original would have to be in, or how factors such as intrinsic value or other things might play into this consideration. Talking about conservation work, which will be very minimal. Okay, that's pretty vague as well. And the document as a whole isn't really that lengthy. So it's only, I think, what, 5 pages, and a lot of space in between the different points. Yeah, even with the support, implement awareness programs for staff and users. Again, what do those programs look like, and so on. So pretty vague general information. Implement awareness strategies. Okay. So you can definitely see that this is a document that talks about preservation and, what the National Archives and Records Service of South Africa wants to accomplish, but again, not a whole lot of specifics about exactly how they're going to go about doing so, which is information that you would be more likely to find in a preservation program. Okay. So next we'll talk about some of the different types of information that may be included in a preservation policy or program document as opposed to a digital preservation policy / program. So these are all fields that the British Library feels should be included in a preservation policy. So obviously this is much more detailed and much more involved than the preservation policy that we just looked at. So this is, at least to me, kind of edging into the complexity of even a program. When you're addressing, I think there are like 20 different things here that the British Library suggests that a policy addresses. So is it interesting to think about which of these apply to analog preservation, which is what we have here, but don't apply to digital preservation? So these were the ones that I came up with. Exhibition and loan, that's not really something that you have to be too concerned about with as it relates to digital preservation or digital records and digital preservation. If you send a digital record out for for another archive to use in an exhibition or to put on some kind of online exhibition, it's not like it's going to get bent in a crate or something like that. So there wouldn't be as much of a concern with this with digital preservation. Self-service copying, I guess that's something that you could address in your archives rules, whether or not researchers can download your digital files, but not necessarily related to preservation as it is in the analog world, where you want to have some kind of policy in place that determines whether or not researchers can make copies in the reading room on their own, or if they need a skilled and trained archivist to do that for them. Pest management and housekeeping, less of an issue with digital preservation, I guess. If you have servers that you're keeping some of your files in, you want to make sure that those are in rooms that are nice and clean, so you don't have, rats and bugs chewing on your server wires or anything like that. But again, not necessarily something that archivists need to worry about as much as with analog preservation, which we all know that, pests and bugs like to eat paper and live in paper and make nests out of paper. And so making sure that there aren't pests in your storage and making sure that everything stays nice and clean is more of a important consideration. Okay, and then conservation. Again, you're not going to send a digital record to a conservator. I guess in some instances, if a record that you have becomes damaged in some way, say in your dark storage or whatnot, and you want to find some way to try and restore that record or retrieve that record, then I guess that's kind of conservation work. But again, just because of the nature of digital materials, there isn't really a book that's rebound or paper that is deacidified or things like that that go on with analog preservation. But a lot of these are pretty similar, even if they were interpreted in different ways. So, example, having a policy about what storage is going to look like. As we've talked about in this course, that's an important thing to have for digital preservation. And obviously, you want to make sure that your analog materials are stored in boxes and in an environment that is conducive to their long-term health. So there are definitely a lot of overlaps, but at least a few, mostly because of the nature of digital records that aren't necessarily things that would be included in a digital preservation policy or even program. Okay, so next we will talk about some of the benefits of going through the process of developing a digital preservation policy, and then further developing your policy into a digital preservation program that your archive follows and adheres to. As the Northeast Document Conservation Center notes, developing preservation policies and programs can help an archives determine what its preservation priorities are. So as a part of going through the different steps that Ritzenthaler mentioned, and including information about the preservation needs that an archive has, especially doing things like a preservation needs and assessment, the part where archives are planning and establishing priorities, that can really give archives an understanding of which records they need to focus on and which records are most in need of preservation or, even God forbid, conservation. There are a few things that can come into this consideration. So obviously, condition is something that that may lead a record to be more of a preservation priority for foreign archives. I think probably a better way to say it would be condition plus amount of use. So if a record is in poor condition and for whatever reason there's a lot of demand to use it in an archive, then that should probably be a preservation priority for the archive. The Rissenthaler chapter also mentioned the idea of intrinsic value, that records might have kind of aesthetic qualities or an attachment to an important context that might also make it more of a preservation policy. Certainly an attachment to the archive's mission might be another another factor that contributes to a record being a preservation priority. So there are a few different things that can make a record a preservation priority, and in a lot of ways, it's going to determine on the context of the archive and the specific needs of the archive. Another benefit of having a preservation policy and implementing a preservation program is that it can be a great advocacy tool, which is something that the Northeast Document Conservation Center and the British Library touch on. Developing a policy and preservation program can, first of all, demonstrate a need for action and show that there are preservation risks in your stacks, that there are important records that are at risk because of preservation concerns surrounding them, and that there is a need for resources to meet that danger. And it also shows that the archives have a plan to meet that danger, that they're not just asking for money with no real inkling of how they're going to meet the different preservation challenges that they've identified. Having this detailed information really shows that you as an archive have done your research, that you have an idea of what you would do with resources that you're given, and that's certainly something that resource allocators like to see. They like to see that there's some kind of method behind the madness. Another thing that a preservation policy and a program does is it demonstrates proactivity by the archive. It shows resource allocators that you're not just kind of sitting back and waiting for problems to come to you, but you're being proactive about identifying them, and that you have the initiative to want to tackle these problems sooner rather than later. And if you can make the case that addressing issues now as opposed to further down the line when they might be worse, that can show resource allocators that you are trying to be thoughtful and efficient with the resources that you have. And again, that's just something that resource allocators like to see. Another benefit of a preservation policy and a preservation program is, as the NEDCC notes, it provides consistency and continuity. So it's essentially provides clarity on what an archive has, how it gets preserved, and why. So instead of the answers to those questions changing, all the time because there's no concrete plan or policy in place that says, here's what we do in response to this, and here's why we do it, there might be different responses or different interpretations, and that can lead to a pretty haphazard and inconsistent response by the archives when faced with preservation issues, which all archives are. So just having that kind of structure and guiding hand in place can be really helpful. Another great thing about policies and programs is, as the British Library notes, it provides a set of goals, and it provides a list of the aspirations that an archive has. And once those are established, over time, archives can take those goals and evaluate how things are going in order to see the overall quality and health of a archive's preservation activities. So if in the archives program they say, you know, we want to have all of our materials in this type of condition, or we want to have all of our AV materials in this type of condition, and some time passes and they go back and they say, okay, well, how close are we to achieving this goal? If you're close, that's great, and it looks like you're on the right track. If you are still struggling to get adequate storage for your AV materials, then you can say, okay, well, this is what we agreed we wanted to do, and it looks like we're not doing that. So let's talk about some of the reasons why this isn't happening. Is there a shortage of resources? Is there more AV stuff than we accounted for or realized? What's going on here, and how can we try and get back on track? So just having those goals that you're attempting to meet is a valuable thing, because again, otherwise it might be difficult for you to know how well you're doing if you don't really have anything to compare your actions to. And it's also important to note that these policies should be reevaluated, and goals should be adjusted over time. So once you set certain goals or certain standards, that doesn't mean that you can just kind of sit back and say, okay, well, we never need to revisit this again. It's always good to kind of go back and see how your goals are, and if your goals need adjusting. Maybe they were a little bit too ambitious. Maybe your archive has received more resources and more support. So now you're able to say, okay, well, let's have, last time we wanted to have half of our AV materials in adequate climate control. Now that we have more climate controlled areas, maybe we can think about having 75% of our AV materials in climate controlled areas. So as time progresses, maybe as the preservation concerns that your archive is facing change, as the resources that you have available change, that suggests the need to make sure that you have goals that adequately represent the ambitions and realities of your archive. You might not need to change analog preservation policies and programs as often as digital ones, simply because the technology surrounding digital preservation changes so frequently, but it's still something that you want to address, fairly regularly. And by doing so, you'll make sure that you have a structure and a system in place that provides some of the benefits of a preservation policy and program that I just talked about. So next, I think it's helpful to look at some of the connections between analog preservation policies and programs and some of the aspects of preservation that we have been talking about throughout this course. So looking at access, there is a lot of overlap between access and a preservation policy. So a preservation policy might dictate that the original records to a collection aren't accessible and researchers will work with copies instead for whatever reason. If a record is regularly accessed, then it might be earmarked for different preservation treatments than other records that are less accessed, and that might be codified in a preservation policy and implemented in a preservation program. So there's this interesting kind of dynamic between preservation and access. You know, records are preserved so that the record itself or information contained in the records remains accessible, but of course access and handling by researchers can lead to damage, right? So there's kind of an interesting kind of give and take there and attention between these two aspects of archiving, and a good preservation policy and a good preservation program will detail exactly what that give and take is going to look like. So next, looking at authenticity, again, getting back to the idea of researchers working with copies of materials that have high value for whatever reason. Again, whether it's because they have intrinsic value or they're particularly important to the repository, maybe they have financial value. For whatever reason, obviously a researcher working with the original actual record is going to be dealing with a more authentic version of that record as opposed to something that might have been copied and given to the researcher to work with. So whatever choices or whatever dictates a preservation policy or program says about when researchers will have access to original records or when they'll be working with copies can impact the authenticity of records that researchers have to work with. Documentation, obviously a preservation policy is a form of documentation. How a preservation program is carried out and implemented should also be documented just so that there's transparency about what decisions were made behind the conservation care that records will receive, what decisions are made about the access researchers will have to original records and so on. All the different aspects of a digital preservation program that I mentioned, they involve decisions that archivists make. And it's important that those decisions are recorded and made available for researchers, for donors, for the public, for stakeholders, just to encourage an overall level of transparency by an archive. Storage, so a preservation policy or program might indicate what type of storage records will be kept in. So a couple of the aspects or elements of a preservation program that Ritzenstaller mentioned are environmental monitoring and control and holdings maintenance and storage systems. So as we talked about with digital preservation, records are going to spend a vast amount of their time in storage. And because of that, it's very important that there's a lot of thought about what that storage is going to look like, and that thought is codified in a preservation policy and decisions surrounding the preservation programming that takes place. Sustainability is a big one. So developing a preservation program and then being able to implement it is a lot of effort, and it can take a lot of resources. Just being able to provide the environment that records need to thrive takes a lot of resources. And it's important that archives consider how they're going to be able to pay for these preservation expenses. So one of the aspects of a preservation policy that the British Library mentioned was financing. So where's the money for preservation going to come from? So when you, as an archive, are developing a preservation policy in a preservation program, you always have to think about what can we actually do. So is it realistic for our goal to say that we want to have 100% of our records located in climate controlled storage, and that we're going to have a very sort of complex conservation effort in our repository, and that we're going to have 3 staff members exclusively devoted to preservation? Or do you have to be maybe more realistic and say, okay, we only have, a half of a staff member that can focus on preservation. We'll try and get 70% of our stuff in climate controlled storage, and so on. So when you're developing your policies and programs, you always need to think about what resources you have and how you can best use them, because obviously there are other priorities that archives have, and you can't throw all of your money into preservation in support of preservation goals that are detailed in preservation policies and preservation programs. As I mentioned before, having these policies and programs developed and showing your stakeholders and donors that you really have put a lot of thought into how your material is preserved can be a good advocacy tool, and it can be something that can at least make it more likely that you are going to receive the resources that you need as an archive, and that your preservation efforts and other archival efforts will be more sustainable. Another interesting one is collaboration. It's always a good idea to take a look at preservation policies and the preservation programs that other institutions have developed, and not having to recreate the wheel. If another archive has a preservation policy or program that seems pretty commensurate with what you as an archive might develop, then you probably don't need to develop a completely new policy. You can just borrow, or there might be a more kind of official and developed partnership that you might develop with another archive, and that's something that you could mention in your policy in your program as well. Looking at some of the archival processes, we talked about outreach. Appraisal is a big one, and it's something that the Ritzenthaler and the British Library readings mentioned. So the need to think about preservation when you are appraising records, and thinking about the preservation program that you have in mind, and saying, okay, well, here is a type of record, and here's the preservation care that we're trying to uphold, and does one fit well into the other, or is the preservation care that this record or these records are going to require, is that more than we're really able to provide? And that's something that going through the steps of developing a policy and a program can really help you understand. You may not realize that the conditions that your records are in are actually not as good as you'd hoped or as you'd thought, and that may impact your appraisal decisions down the road. Looking at research or services, again, I talked about the tension between access and preservation. So people that are making reference requests might really prefer to see the most authentic or original version of a record, but according to your policy or according to the program that you're implementing, that might not always be possible. So there could definitely be some ways in which your archive's documented preservation policies don't really meet the wishes or needs of people who are contacting or working with researcher services in order to see records. Processing is an interesting one. There might be some kind of policy that talks about what kind of conditions records will be kept in while they're being processed. So if you're going to be processing an AV collection and it seems like it might take a long time, then you might want to work on processing those in a climate controlled area as opposed to having them outside of a climate controlled area for potentially weeks or months on end. So that might be something that is dictated in a preservation program. Exactly what processing looks like from a preservation perspective. What kind of folders, boxes or records might be put into during processing. Is there any kind of staple and paperclip removal that goes on? These might be things that are documented in a preservation policy or described in a preservation program. And last but not least, we'll talk about social justice. So it might be the case that your archive has records that come from a particular community, and that community might have very particular thoughts or cultural traditions surrounding how material should be preserved. And that's obviously something that you want to include in your preservation programming as well, making sure that your archive has it codified that you're going to treat certain materials in a way that is culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive. Because the last thing that you as an archive want to do is kind of dump on another community's thoughts and traditions by preserving their records in a way that that doesn't meet their wishes or their expectations. I suppose as an archive you can do that because technically the records are probably yours, although who knows what the provenance of them might be, but really they're a responsible and respectable thing to do. The thing that doesn't further kind of delegitimize and marginalize communities and community members is to try and implement their preservation wishes and goals in your own preservation programming. Okay, and we'll wrap things up by connecting the idea of preservation policies and developing and implementing a preservation program with some of the principles from the Harvey and Mahard article. So we talked about advocacy is necessary to ensure preservation and how preservation policies and preservation programs can be a great advocacy tool. Taking preservation action now is better than doing anything or better than doing nothing. So just by taking the steps to have more of an understanding of what types of analog materials your archive has and what conditions they're in, that can certainly be classified as doing something now, as opposed to just kind of delaying and continuing to remain in the dark about exactly what materials are potentially rotting and molding away on your stacks. Another interesting one is preservation actions should not exceed the abilities of the personnel who apply them. So in your preservation policy or in your preservation program, you might say, these are the people that are going to work with records as far as any preservation efforts go. Or if we have records that need conservation, that's sort of beyond our skill level. So, here's some vendors that we might work with. Having that information available and included in preservation programming can make it less likely that people are going to attempt to do things that they really shouldn't, that they're going to attempt to preserve or conserve records in a way that is beyond their skill level. We talked about preservation actions should adhere to ethical considerations. So these ethical considerations can be incorporated into a preservation policy and preservation programming. This one here, prefer preservation actions that address large quantities of material over actions that focus on individual objects. That's something that the Ritzenthaler chapter mentioned. And I believe the British Library's document as well, that you need to have policies that address kind of your collections broadly. And if you kind of get into the weeds with a policy or with your programming that says, this record in this particular collection will be kept under these conditions, and you do that for every single collection, then, that's going to get complex and messy really quick. So you really want to have policies and programs that address large swaths of your records as much as possible. Again, just to kind of prevent your preservation efforts from getting too focused or too kind of narrowly focused on one record or even a specific set of records. So there are definitely some overlaps between preservation policies and preservation programming and the principles that Harvey and Mahard argue or offer. Keeping the originals, keeping multiple copies of objects, these might be things that are mentioned in a preservation policy or in preservation programming. We talked about the need for appraisal and how that can be tied into preservation policies and programming as well. So there are definitely a lot of overlaps between these principles and our topic for this week. Okay, so we will call it a day there. So again, we talked about some of the aspects of digital preservation policies and digital preservation programming. We looked at how policies and programs might differ between analog and digital records. And we talked about some of the overall benefits of working on developing a digital preservation policy and implementing digital preservation programming. And then we connected it to some of the overarching topics that we have discussed throughout this class. So I wanted to take this lecture to kind of introduce you to some of the particular challenges of analog preservation, and we'll focus more on those for the rest of the semester, but also talk about how those challenges differ from the digital preservation that we have been talking about for the past many weeks. And we'll continue to explore those similarities and differences as we move through this semester as well. So as always, thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week.